Hi there, everybody. We have the fourth and final video in this webinar series on writing with sources. And this video is going to focus specifically on strategies for integrating source information. So what I mean by that is basically how to summarize source information, how to paraphrase it, and how to quote it directly. Strategies for doing that effectively and appropriately in your research-based argumentative paper. So let's get to it. The first strategy for integrating source information that I'll talk about is summarizing. Now, summarizing is something that I'm sure everyone is already familiar with, but sometimes when you stop and think about it, you might wonder, well, what exactly am I supposed to put in a summary? How much information is too much? How much is not enough? And really that depends on what you're summarizing and why you're summarizing it and how you're going to use it in your paper. But a good rule of thumb is just to give your reader the gist of that lengthy piece of text and relay only the most important information and ideas and the supporting details. So cut out all of the really specific details from that piece and just focus on what matters the most, what's the main argument, what do you want people to know about it after having read it and when you're sharing it with them. So be sure that when you're summarizing, you're using your own words as much as you can and that you're really trying to boil things down, make them more concise, be brief. If you're summarizing a quantitative piece too, that's something with a lot of numbers, a lot of data, a lot of really technical information. Sometimes that can be overwhelming. My advice is try not to get too hung up on those numbers. Just focus on what they mean. What is the author doing with those numbers? What are they trying to say and explain from them? And then tell us that. So again, overall, just give us the most important pieces of information there, especially the main idea. Put it in your own words and be brief. Next up, we have paraphrase. So I'll explain paraphrasing in comparison to summary. First things first, it is like a summary in that you're also using your own words here for paraphrase to convey the meaning of the text that you're writing about. So your own words, your own structure too, that's important because it's not just a matter of taking the original sentence and using a few synonyms here and there. It's also a matter of reorganizing those ideas in a way that makes sense to you. So the best thing you can do for that is to make sure you understand that text well enough to be able to put it off to the side and write about it without looking back at it. That can help ensure that you are using your own words and your own structure and not borrowing too closely and getting into those fine lines of potential plagiarism. Also with a paraphrase, in addition to using your own words and your own structure, you want to try to keep the details as you restate what that piece is talking about. So that's how, even though it's similar to the summary in using your own words, it's different from the summary because in the summary you try to cut back a lot of information, whereas in the paraphrase you want to keep that information. So the paraphrase text that you write is going to be similar in length to the piece of text that you're paraphrasing, if that makes sense. They're more or less equal there in length and details. For example, you might choose to paraphrase a findings paragraph from a source that you're using because maybe all of the information in that paragraph is super important to your paper's own argument. So you don't want to lose any of that good detail, but you still want to state it in a way that's clear and effective for your readers. Okay, we've talked about summarizing and we've talked about paraphrasing. Now we're going to talk a little bit about directly quoting from a source. So here's a few tips for you if you plan to pull quotes from the sources that you're using in your research and put them directly into your paper. Basically, the thing that you're doing when you're quoting is you're borrowing words exactly as they're written in the source, and you're doing it because the author has stated that idea in such a precise way that that's exactly how you want to share it in your own work as well. You don't feel like you'd be contributing anything by restating it in your own words for your reader. So make sure that when you are quoting, you're using appropriate punctuation to show that it's a quote, that it's not just an idea borrowed from a source, it's the words themselves borrowed from a source. So the way that you do that is with quotation marks. Of course, there's other punctuation that you can use if you're going to be changing anything from the original source. For example, you can use brackets if you want to show modification to words. And you might do that if you want to, for example, explain a pronoun that the author used. What does it stand for? Or you might do it to change a verb tense so that it better fits in and flows with your sentence that you're integrating it into. You can also use ellipses if you want to delete part of a quote. Sometimes they just get too long and you want to cut just a section of it out. So you can use that ... to show that you have cut some information from the full quote. Also, if you are using any lengthy quotes, which I don't recommend to do in excess or even at all if your paper is relatively short. But if you are using really long quotes in part of your paper, then make sure that you're following the proper block quote formatting conventions according to whichever style guide you're using to format your paper, APA, MLA, Chicago, so on. And my last tip here for quoting directly from a source is to avoid patchwork style writing. So what I mean by that is stringing together several quotes without doing a good job of introducing and contextualizing that source information, connecting it to the other ideas in your paper and your overall argument, or analyzing and explaining what those quotes mean, what they're about, and why you've included them. So this would just be quote after quote after quote without enough from you, the author of this paper, to guide us through those quotes, what they mean, and why you've included them. So I've also pulled from Purdue OWL here some helpful templates that can help you avoid that patchwork style writing that I was just talking about. So these templates can help you introduce quotations, and they can also help you explain quotations. So this is just a good starting place for you if you're trying to figure out how to integrate those quotes into your writing. Here on the left side, you see some examples of how to introduce quotations. The author states, comma, in the quote. You could say, in her article, blah, 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 blah. The author suggests that, and then you have the quote, and so on and so forth. And then over on the right side, some ideas for how to get from the quote to an explanation of it. Let's look at a couple of those. You could say what the author really means is that blah, 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 and you're restating it in your own words, and so on and so forth. Just some ideas for you to help you think about not just dropping those quotes in, but doing something with them, saying what they mean, and telling us why you're including them, and also where they're coming from, all of that kind of good stuff that helps guide the reader through your ideas as they're developing. This chart offers just a recap of what we've been talking about, showing you quickly the differences and similarities between summary, paraphrase, and quote. So summary and paraphrase, remember, those are both in your own words, in your own structure, restated from the original. The summary, that's the only one out of these three that's going to be shorter than the original. Of course, maybe the quote will be shorter if you decide to delete some from it and use the ellipses to show that deletion. But generally, the summary is the only one that's going to be significantly shorter than the original text, because you want to try to be as concise as possible with that one. And you'll also notice here that under the requires citation, all three of these are checked. So for some reason, sometimes people think you only need a citation if you're directly quoting. Actually, you need a citation anytime you're borrowing ideas, not just words, from another source, because you want to give credit to that author for those ideas and what you are taking from them to use in your own writing too. So it's not to say that you shouldn't be using ideas from other people. In fact, you should. You just want to make sure that you give recognition to it, whether it's their words or their ideas that you're borrowing. Here's just a few final thoughts for you on this topic of integrating source information into your writing. The first is to use summary, paraphrase, and quotes intentionally because they each serve a different purpose. Remember, we talked about quotes you want to use because it's stated so precisely in the original, you can't improve upon it by restating. Summary you would use because you want it to be more concise, brief, to the point. You don't need all of those details in there. And paraphrase you would use because you do need to restate an idea to make it more clear and make it flow better with the style and tone of your paper at that time. Second tip for you, don't lose your own voice amongst all these voices of other people from your sources. You're still in control of this paper. So like we talked about when we said avoid that patchwork writing, make sure that you're introducing source information, you're analyzing it, you're explaining it, and you're making those connections apparent for your reader as you walk them through why you're bringing in this piece of source information, this piece of evidence, why you've included it, and how it fits in with your overall argument. Always make it clear to your reader whose ideas are whose when you do bring in source information. So I like to suggest, along with this one, that the first time you're incorporating information from a source, you go ahead and just briefly introduce that source, and don't wait until after you've given us a bunch of information from it to tell us, oh, by the way, here's a parenthetical citation, so you know that I just got all that information from somewhere else. Tell us up front. It just helps us know, oh, now you're going to share with us some information that's coming from somewhere else. And then we can just follow along easier, and we know right away this is coming from somewhere in case we want to go to that source and look further into it. So whether you do it in your sentence directly in like an introductory phrase there or in a parenthetical citation, just make sure we know anytime you're borrowing words or ideas that we know those are coming from somewhere and where they're coming from. Finally, you want to also remember to follow the appropriate conventions from your field for using source information. So here's what I mean by that. Courses in the humanities, they might privilege quoting over summarizing and paraphrasing because they really want to allow the source that you're borrowing information from to speak for themselves and share their theoretical musings or whatever the complicated idea is. They want to convey that in the author's own original language, maybe because it's complicated or whatever. But that's in comparison to, for example, writing that's done in the hard sciences, where typically they'll privilege paraphrasing over directly quoting, summarizing and paraphrasing over directly quoting, because they want to say, here's all this research that has come before, and here's what we learned from it, and then now here's room for my primary research that I want to share, and contribute to this conversation on this research topic. So basically, they're doing that lit review method where they give a bunch of information really quickly from other sources. And the best way to do that is by putting it in their own words and cutting some of the details out of it. So that's just to show you that it's not necessarily right or wrong to do one method of integration over another, but you have to know why you're doing it. And you should take into consideration the expectations and conventions from your field, because they may have reasons that have developed over time for doing it one way over another. All right, we've talked about a lot of different things in terms of writing with sources. We've talked about how to approach the task. We've talked about types of evidence that you can use, analysis and synthesis of source information, and now different strategies for integrating source information into your writing. So I hope some of this information has been helpful to you, and you'll be able to take it and use it when you do your next writing project. But remember that the Writing Center is always here for you should you need us. And we think that all writers can benefit from setting a little time aside to talk to another writer about their writing. So why not go ahead and make an appointment to meet with a writing tutor online? You can do that by signing into My LMU, clicking Academics, and then clicking the Writing and Course Tutoring link. So if you have any questions or you want some clarification about anything that we covered in this webinar, feel free to reach out to the Academic Resource Center. That email is arc@lmu.edu, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.